Have you ever looked at the news and felt that there is something much bigger behind those headlines, as if there were an invisible gear moving everything under the hood? That's that. Maybe you're not so wrong. What if what the world calls regional conflict is actually a chapter announced millennia ago? What if the next war in the Middle East is the exact fulfillment of an ancient Bible prophecy, detailed, named, and ignored by entire generations? The problem is that while most are preoccupied with politics, economics, or ideology, few realize that the real battlefield is spiritual. And at the center of it all, two nations stare at each other with eyes of fury, Iran and Israel. But what few people have the courage to say is that this tension is not new. It was announced before it even existed. And if the reading of Ezekiel 38 is correct, we are already living the first steps of a prophetic war of apocalyptic proportions. Perhaps you have been taught to view the Bible as a book of the past, but today you will understand why it can be the key to deciphering the future. And what is about to happen can transform the world as we know it. The question that remains is, are you prepared to see what is behind the veil of reality? When you look at the headlines about Iran, it's easy to think that this is just another geopolitical crisis. But what if I told you that there's something much deeper going on behind the scenes? The tension hanging over the Middle East did not come out of nowhere. It is like an ember that has been burning for centuries, fueled by historical disputes, spiritual rivalries, and above all, biblical prophecies. Iran, the former Persian Empire, carries not only modern weapons, but a millennial baggage of conflicts with Israel. And it is precisely this collision between past, present, and future that is about to explode for good. We are not talking about ordinary war, but of an ongoing prophetic conflict. The animosity between Iran and Israel goes far beyond political differences. It is a dispute rooted in starkly opposed worldviews, one that believes in its spiritual right to the Holy Land, and another that carries a biblical promise of restoration and dominion. With each threat uttered by Iranian leaders, the echo of Scripture seems to intensify. Ezekiel's book already pointed to this scenario with millimeter precision, and it is no exaggeration to say that in the 21st century, the whole world is sitting on a barrel of prophetic powder. Yes, you read that right. Ezekiel 38 is more alive than ever. Iran has become a key player in this global tension, financing extremist groups, challenging Western powers, and above all, testing the limits of Israel's patience. But behind all this, there is a question that few have the courage to ask. Is Iran being prepared to fulfill a prophetic role? When we look at the map and connect recent actions with Scripture, it feels like time is shortening. And we are not only dealing with weapons of war, but with eschatological signs in full manifestation. What appears to be just international politics may actually be the prelude to the end times. And there's more. The broken agreements, the sanctions imposed, and the inflammatory speeches are just the surface of something much deeper. Iran is wounded in its pride, pressured by threats and driven by an ideology that sees confrontation as an almost sacred duty. When Iranian leaders talk about wiping Israel off the map, it is not mere rhetoric. It is a mirror of biblical prophecies, a stark sign that the spiritual realm is unfolding before our eyes, even if most of humanity is still blind to it. The truth? It is not an ordinary war. It is a prophetic war. And what makes this even more intriguing is the fact that this tension did not arise overnight. There were decades, even centuries, of antagonism, strategic alliances, religious manipulations, and geopolitical interests. What happens in Iran is not restricted to Iran. Every missile launched, every military base deployed, every alliance made with Russia or China resonates directly with the center of eschatology, Israel. Tension in the Middle East is not just an international crisis, it is a spiritual thermometer of the world we live in. And this thermometer is already marking critical levels. Those who observe only with natural eyes see politics, oil, power. But those who see with spiritual discernment realize that there is a celestial gear in motion. The parts are being positioned with surgical precision. Iran, for all its strategic arrogance, is being pulled to the center of the apocalyptic stage. And that's not a conspiracy theory. It is the pure Bible. Prophets like Ezekiel already spoke about this movement in chapter 38. And if you pay close attention, you will notice that the names have changed, but the spiritual characters remain the same. The conflict intensifies as Iran isolates itself while strengthening its connections with other major nations. The Russian and Chinese presence in the surroundings is no coincidence. Everything seems to point to a prophetic alliance that refers directly to the union between Gog and Magog, foreseen in the scriptures. We are witnessing the rehearsals of one of the most tense chapters in eschatology. And even if the headlines try to hide it with euphemisms and diplomatic terms, the reality is clear. We are closer to the apocalypse than many imagine. This whole tension is not just about international politics. It's about a very well-designed spiritual plan. The wars of the Old Testament were never just wars. They have always carried a prophetic purpose. And with Iran, this is no different. The country is being pushed to fulfill a narrative that has been written for millennia. And the more it resists, the faster it seems to fulfill this role. What for many is chaos and instability, for those who understand the Bible, is prophetic fulfillment in real time. Incredible and scary at the same time. The fuse has already been triggered. The newspapers may not admit it, but the signs are everywhere. The military movement, the ideological manipulation, the regional instability all point to the beginning of something much bigger. And the most impressive thing is that the leaders involved themselves seem unaware of their role within this prophetic mechanism. But as we have seen so many times in the Bible, God uses even the wicked to accomplish his purposes. And with Iran, this is becoming more and more evident. Get ready, the prophetic clock is counting down. And then you ask me, but why does all this matter to me here and now? Because when the prophetic scene moves in the Middle East, the impact is global and spiritual. The tension in Iran is just the first domino that could set off a sequence of irreversible events. We are seeing the first steps of something that the ancient prophets already warned about in earnest. And the worst thing we can do is ignore the signs and go on as if everything is normal. Anyway, what if the next step is just what is in Ezekiel 38? From the earliest times, Bible prophecies have not only served as predictions of the future, they are living warnings, divine messages in code form. God has never left his people in the dark, but has always anticipated the great events of history in stunning detail. The problem is that many people treat prophecy as if it were outdated symbology, when in fact it is the key to understanding the present. The Bible is more current than any television news, and if you look closely you will realize what is happening today in Iran and the Middle East has been announced for centuries. When we read Ezekiel 38 and 39, we are not only facing an apocalyptic account, but a true script of spiritual and geopolitical warfare. There are the names, the nations, the purposes. Gog and Magog are not fantasy characters. They are archetypes and representations of royal alliances which have already begun to form. It is as if the text screams from the past, drawing our attention to the present. Iran, involved up to its neck in conflicts, appears there as an active part of this scenario. And the question that remains is, why is almost no one talking about this in the churches? The truth is that much of Christendom has become accustomed to reading the prophecies as if they were only symbolic illustrations with no real application. But the Middle East scenario is asking for help, crying out for discernment. Everything is falling into place with prophetic exactitude. The rise of Iran, the threats to Israel, the formation of hostile geopolitical blocs. All of this has already been predicted in millennial texts. and you can no longer say that it is a coincidence. Biblical eschatology is being fulfilled before our eyes, line by line, chapter by chapter. Prophets such as Daniel, Isaiah, Joel, and of course Ezekiel were used by God to build a mosaic of revelations. They did not write by chance, nor by poetic inspiration. They wrote as they were moved by the Spirit to warn future generations, including our own. The great challenge is to take these prophecies out of the drawer of theology and put them back in the pulpit, in conversations, in the daily life of faith. Because the time is passing, but the word remains, and in it there are clear maps of what is happening and what is yet to come. Revelation is not only the book of the end, it is the book of the beginning of full revelation. And at this point, Iran emerges as a central character, mentioned in an indirect but unmistakable way. Ancient names like Persia, Cush, and Put point to modern nations that today align themselves against Israel. And this finding, my friend, cannot be ignored. When you connect the dots, you realize that the war in Iran is not just political, it is the activation of a prophetic plan that is nearing its climax. And this affects everything, with nations, with peoples, and especially with you. It is important to remember that Jesus also spoke about these times. In Matthew 24, he warned that there would be wars, rumors of wars, nations against nations, and all of this would be just the beginning of the pains. Sound familiar? It looks like today's news, but contrary to what many think, the prophecy is not to generate panic, but preparation. It is not to make anyone afraid, but rather discerning. And as the signs intensify, the need to go back to the scriptures becomes urgent. The Bible is crying, and he who has ears, let him listen. Another powerful detail in biblical prophecies is that they always point to a greater purpose, God's sovereignty over everything and everyone. Not even Iran escapes this control. The alliances that are formed, the conflicts that erupt, the speeches that inflame, all serve to confirm that the word is alive. It is as if each political act were a verse materializing. It changes the way we see the world. We are not just witnessing a new international crisis, we are witnessing the materialization of an eternal narrative. What's more, these prophecies were not written for seminary scholars. They were written for ordinary people like you and me, people who live, suffer, work, raise children. But that needs to be alert, because if the time of the end is as close as it seems, then you can't live distracted. You can't leave the scriptures closed, nor treat the apocalypse as if it were a distant movie. Prophecy is God's spiritual alarm, and he's playing hard. Are you listening? The most impactful thing about all of this is realizing that the more the world ignores the scriptures, the more they are fulfilled. It is as if God said, you can mock, you can ridicule, but I will fulfill every promise, every word, and he is complying. The war in Iran, the growth of tension in the Middle East, the threat to Israel, and none of this is new to those who know the prophecies. What was a theory 20 years ago has now become headlines, and in a little while, it will become history. Looking at all this, it is clear that we are facing something much bigger than international politics. We are facing the revelation of a divine plan in progress. The Bible is not outdated, it is being fulfilled. And Iran, with all its warlike protagonism, is being used as an instrument of prophetic confirmation. You may try to ignore it, but the truth will keep revealing. And the next piece of that puzzle may be about to move. Anyway, what role exactly does Iran play in this apocalyptic scenario that is being drawn? Have you noticed how Iran is always at the center of the greatest global tensions, even without being an economic or technological superpower? Well, this is not by chance. It is as if an invisible force pushes him more and more to the center of the decisions that shape the fate of the world. And when we look through the lens of biblical prophecy, Iran's presence on the eschatological chessboard becomes impossible to ignore. It is as if history is repeating the steps of prophecy accurately. Iran is not just a country. It is an active symbol in the apocalyptic scenario that is being drawn. In the Bible, Iran appears under the name of Persia. And guess what? This nation has a history of strategic appearances in the great events of the divine plan. It was Persia that delivered the Jews from captivity in Babylon through Cyrus, God's anointed. But now, that same land carries discourses that call for Israel's destruction. What an irony, right? Those who were once instruments of restoration now threaten to be instruments of destruction. But this was also foreseen. God is not surprised. He orchestrates. Iran in the 21st century is far from being just a spectator. He funds militias, fuels hatred, strengthens dark alliances with Russia, China, and other nations that appear in the prophecy of Ezekiel 38 as part of the coalition led by Gog. It's like watching a prophetic chess game. The pieces are moving, and Iran is one of them, strategic, bold, and dangerous. With each movement of him, the approach of Gog and Magog becomes clearer. The board is assembled. And the spiritual checkmate may be closer than we think, but Iran's role goes beyond political movements. There is a very heavy spiritual charge behind what it represents. The spirit of opposition, persecution, and deception that hangs over him goes back to ancient ages, when empires rose up against God's people. Iran is an epicenter of this resistance, and when Bible prophecies speak of a covenant against Israel, it is not for nothing that Persia is listed. Radical ideology, Islamic apocalyptic discourse, and the desire for control over Jerusalem are fuels for this prophetic conflict. Iran's influence is not limited to its territory. It extends its tentacles through Hezbollah, Hamas, and other organizations that operate as arms of a silent war. A war that in the eyes of the world seems political, but spiritually, it is an age-old battle for the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. So when you hear about a Hezbollah attack on northern Israel, remember, Iran is behind it, and behind Iran, Bible prophecies continue to be fulfilled with frightening fidelity. And it doesn't stop there. Iran has declared nuclear ambitions, and that adds even more fuel to the end times fire. Imagine what might happen if this hostile regime has unfettered access to weapons of mass destruction. The fragile balance of the Middle East would be broken in the blink of an eye. And once again, the Bible has already spoken about fire, destruction, shaking of the nations. The apocalypse, once seen as something distant, is beginning to take concrete shape before our eyes, and Iran is at the center of this equation. But perhaps the most delicate point is the fact that Iran sees itself as the protagonist of its own apocalypse. For many of their religious leaders, war with Israel is not just desired. It is necessary for the coming of their Messiah, the Mahdi. Yes, that's right. They believe that chaos is the path to redemption. This means that Iran acts driven by an inverted spiritual vision. And here the conflict is not only between nations, it is between completely opposite eschatological visions. On the one hand, God's plan. On the other, the distortion of the enemy. Iran's role on the prophetic chessboard also shows us a precious lesson. God can use any nation, even the most rebellious, to accomplish his will. Iran thinks it is in control, but in fact, it is just another piece in the hands of the Most High. And when we look at this reality with spiritual eyes, we see something powerful. Even chaos can be used to reveal the glory of God. Iran, without realizing it, is paving the way for one of the greatest clashes in prophetic history. And every step it takes brings it closer to doomsday. Therefore, you cannot be oblivious. Iran is not just a matter of geopolitics, it is a sign from heaven. It is an arrow pointing to what has been announced for centuries. When he moves, the spiritual world stirs. When he threatens, God's promises to Israel are challenged, and when he advances, the angels of the Lord are already taking position. What seems to be just another crisis, in fact, is the execution of a meticulous prophetic script, and the stage is almost ready for the final act. Now stop and think. If Iran has such a striking role on the eschatological chessboard, what else can come? What other pieces are positioning themselves without us noticing? Iran's move is just one sign, but where are the other signs? Is the battle of Gog and Magog, described in Ezekiel, about to leave the pages and enter reality? And if the next prophetic event is just what the Bible called final war? Imagine opening the Bible and finding, in a text written more than 2,500 years ago, the exact description of an alliance of nations against Israel, and realizing that these same nations are already aligning today. This is exactly what happens when we read Ezekiel 38 and 39. The prophecy is neither vague nor too symbolic. It names places, describes strategies, and speaks of a mass attack led by a character named Gog, coming from the land of Magog. When we connect the dots with current events, the question arises, are we about to live through this prophesied war? According to many scholars, Gog represents a military or political leader who will unite a powerful coalition against Israel. Magog, in turn, is associated with northern regions, traditionally identified with Russia and its allies, but it doesn't stop there. Ezekiel also mentions Persia, present-day Iran, Kush, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Put, Libya, Tunisia, as well as Togarmah and Gomer, which many associate with modern-day Turkey. Now tell me, have you ever seen these nations close to each other, cooperating militarily, getting closer economically? Because it's happening, and it's not by chance. It's as if Ezekiel is handing us a puzzle with the pieces already cut, just waiting for someone to fit them together. And the most impressive thing is that these pieces are positioning themselves with no human effort to interpret them. Iran, as we have already seen, is at the forefront of verbal and spiritual confrontation with Israel. Russia is strategically positioned in Syria. Turkey, although part of NATO, has flirted with a more Islamist and authoritarian stance. All these geopolitical movements may be only political, or they may be the march of Gog and Magog. Now let's look at another detail that Ezekiel gives us. The moment of war happens when Israel is at peace, dwelling in safety without walls. Now this sounds contradictory in the midst of so much current tension, right? But it may be just the ideal scenario. A temporary peace agreement, a strategic truce, or even a global distraction can create this sense of false security. The prophecy points to a sudden attack, a well-aimed blow, motivated by greed, by a desire to plunder, by accumulated hatred. The war will be as brutal as it is unexpected. And we are not talking about an ordinary war, the kind that the world has become accustomed to watching. Ezekiel 39 makes it clear that it will be a conflict of supernatural proportions. God himself will intervene. He will rise up in anger, causing earthquakes, plagues, rain of fire and brimstone. This is not a metaphor. It is divine manifestation in judgment. And the most disturbing detail, the Bible says that weapons and bodies will take 7 years to be completely disposed of. 7 years. Do you have any idea what this represents? The scale of this war will be apocalyptic. This direct intervention of God also serves something greater, to reveal his sovereignty to the nations. In a world that insists on ignoring the Bible, God will let everyone know that he is still Lord over history. The purpose of Ezekiel 38 and 39 is not only to show the destruction of Israel's enemies, but to restore the fear of the Lord's name. Bible prophecies are not just warnings of doom, they are windows into divine character. And what we see in them is a God who still cares about his people and justice. Another point worthy of attention is the prophetic time in which this war is to take place. Many scholars believe that it will take place before the Great Tribulation as an event that sets the stage for the world for the rise of the Antichrist. Others believe that it will be at the beginning of the tribulation or even at the end, linked to the Battle of Armageddon. The fact is, the clock is ticking and the stage is being set up. And Iran, along with other nations, seems increasingly willing to pull the trigger. Is Gog someone who is already alive, or is it a spirit operating through leaders? No matter which theory you choose to pursue, they all point to the same reality. We are nearing the fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy. The characters are alive, the alliances are firm, the inflammatory speeches are in the headlines, and the tension, like a rubber band stretched to the maximum, seems about to break. When Gog decides to march, there will be no more time for speculation. The war will not only be between armies, it will be between heaven and earth, and all that it is already described with astonishing precision. Interestingly, God himself says that he will put hooks in Gog's mouth and draw him into this battle. This shows that even when evil seems to take the initiative, it is the Lord who has ultimate control. Gog will not act of his own free will. He will be taken, led, used for the glory of God to be manifested. This should bring us fear and hope at the same time. Fear for the greatness of the events, hope because we know that, in the end, the victory belongs to the Lord. And if all this movement is really a few steps away from happening, how should we live? How should we prepare? Because if Ezekiel 38 and 39 are about to be fulfilled, that changes everything. Our priorities, our relationship with God, our understanding of the world. Prophecy is not meant to scare us, but to wake us up. The world is asleep, and Gog's prophetic roar may already be echoing through the nations. The question is, are you listening? You know when you feel like something is out of place, but you can't explain exactly what. This sensation has a name in the scriptures, signs of the times. Jesus warned us that before the end, the world would see certain signs, as if they were warning signs on the road of history. And honestly, these signs are no longer just visible, are flashing neon. Wars, rumors of war, pandemics, earthquakes, moral crises, persecution of Christians, all of these are in the prophetic package. The problem is that many are distracted, living as if nothing was happening. Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13 are chapters that function as true manuals of eschatological survival. Jesus was explicit. The days would be evil, love would grow cold, false prophets would arise, and the truth would be despised. When we look around, it seems that we're reading the newspaper of heaven dated today. The Middle East has become a constant stage of conflict. Iran continues to threaten Israel. The Promised Land lives under tension. And all this fulfills, without taking or putting on, the signs of the times prophesied by the All-Seeing One. Another glaring sign is apostasy, the abandonment of the faith. Churches emptied of fear, leaders bowing to culture, and a generation growing up allergic to the truth. This spiritual cooling is also part of the prophetic scenario. The apocalypse will not be built only with tanks and bombs, but with callous hearts and seared minds. And Iran, with its antagonistic stance towards Christianity and the people of God, symbolizes this spiritual resistance that grows like a shadow over the world. A shadow that already creeps behind many structures, but there are also geophysical signals. The earth seems to be groaning. Natural disasters multiply, the climate has gone mad, and the seas roar with intensity. Nature itself participates in this process as if it were reacting to the weight of sin and the approach of judgment. Ezekiel speaks of gigantic earthquakes during the war of Gog and Magog. John describes stars falling, waters bitter, and creation falling apart. If you think this is all a coincidence, you may need to revise your spiritual map. Because Bible prophecies are materializing before us, Israel is another of the greatest prophetic thermometers. Since it became a nation again in 1948, something absolutely unprecedented in history, the prophetic hourglass began to turn. Every new threat against Jerusalem, every terrorist attack, every attempt to divide the Holy Land, all of this fulfills ancient words. Iran is by far the biggest agent of this pressure. Its allies are surrounding Israel with constant threats. And when you put all of that together with what's written in Zechariah, Isaiah, Joel, and Revelation, the puzzle begins to become frighteningly complete. Global digitization, social control, mass surveillance, the advancement of artificial intelligence, all of these may seem modern, but in eschatology it is called preparation. The mark of the beast, described in Revelation 13, requires a technology of economic tracking and exclusion that, until a few decades ago, seemed impossible. Today, it's reality, and the most curious thing is that many of the countries that develop and test these technologies are either allied with Iran or involved in direct eschatological conflicts. None of this is by chance. It is a scenario being shaped millimeters from prophecy. The persecution of Christians is also growing at an alarming rate. In Middle Eastern countries, many of which are allied with Iran, the simple act of professing faith in Jesus is punishable by imprisonment or death. And that's not a detail. Jesus said that his followers would be hated for his name's sake. This hatred is spreading, and not only in hostile countries, it is already in universities, in movies, in legislation. The world is taking a stand against the Messiah, and when that happens, you can bet the signs of the times are almost over. But perhaps the most telling of all the signs is the increase in knowledge and the speed of transformations. Daniel spoke of this. In the time of the end, many would run to and fro and knowledge would multiply. Today, humanity is experiencing an avalanche of data, connections, and paradigm shifts. What was innovation yesterday is now obsolete. But amid so much information, there is a vacuum of spiritual wisdom. The most connected generation in history is also one of the most spiritually lost. A paradox that, guess what? It was also prophesied. So there is no denying it. The prophecies are in motion. What was once theory is now practice. What was a shadow became a clear image. Iran's wars, alliances against Israel, moral collapse, natural disasters, all of these are already written. And as much as many try to cover their eyes or say that they are religious exaggerations, the truth is still there, imprinted in the scriptures, screaming for attention. And if the signs are already being fulfilled, the question that remains is, what is the next step in the prophetic plan? Because if all of this is already before us, what is yet to come? And if the signs we see today are only the beginning of the pain, as Jesus said, what's next? The stage is set, the pieces are moving, and the skies are about to break through with new intervention. And it is precisely at this point that the dilemma arises. We are entering a time of inevitable despair. Or is there still room for hope? When we talk about prophetic war, it is natural for the heart to tighten. After all, who in their right mind wants to see global destruction, pain, and instability? But the biblical perspective on these events is profoundly different from the human view. What for the world represents the collapse of order, for God can be the beginning of a new cycle of redemption. It's paradoxical, I know, but biblical prophecies always walk that threshold between judgment and mercy, between justice and salvation. And that changes everything, including the way we should face what is to come. Imagine a world in full upheaval, shaken by wars, by the advance of evil, by the collapse of social structures. Now imagine that same world as a fertile field for spiritual awakening. That's exactly what the scriptures show. In the midst of chaos, God raises voices. In the midst of despair, he generates faith. The war between Iran and Israel may seem like the beginning of the end, but for many, it will be the beginning of a reunion with the Creator. And this is the true spiritual impact of a prophetic conflict. It shakes the structures and awakens the sleepers. Of course, there is pain. Of course, there is suffering. The Bible does not mask reality, it does. But even in the darkest texts, such as those of Ezekiel 38 and 39, or in the Apocalypse itself, there is always a thread of hope, a remnant, a promise. War brings judgment, yes, but it also calls for repentance. And this is something that needs to be said. The suffering that befalls the world is often God's megaphone for deaf hearts. He cries out in the midst of catastrophes, "Turn to me before it is too late." In this context, Iran assumes a deeper role than we imagine, not only as an aggressor, but as an instrument of a scenario that will force humanity to face the invisible. As tension in the Middle East grows, fear spreads, insecurity grows, and with it, so does the search for spiritual answers. And here's the key point. War is not the end of faith. It can be her reset. Eschatology, in this aspect, does not only serve to frighten, but to attract. It is a call to wake up from the torpor. Perhaps this is the greatest dilemma of our time, to see destruction approaching and at the same time to find in it the hope of a new birth. The war between Iran and Israel, if it really materializes as described in biblical prophecies, will be a tragedy in human terms, but spiritually, it could be one of the greatest awakenings in history. Yes, God can even use fire to cleanse. You can use war to reveal the Prince of Peace. You can use pain to bring the world back into your presence. And here comes a necessary provocation. Where is the church in the midst of all this? Is it hiding or positioning itself? Are you preaching hope or reproducing panic? Because the mission of God's people is not to flee from chaos, but to be light within it. When bombs explode, the knees must bend. When uncertainty reigns, faith must rise. The spiritual impact of a prophetic war depends in large part on how God's people respond. And now is not the time for silence. It is the time for proclamation. War between nations can cause destruction, but spiritual warfare can cause transformation. Many who mock the scriptures today will desperately seek them. Many who are ignorant of the name of Jesus will cry out to him in the midst of the rubble. It's sad, but it's real. There are hearts that only surrender when everything around them collapses. And perhaps, in the face of impending war, the world will see a generation of faith forged in fire emerge. The apocalypse, as hard as it is still a divine love letter, a last attempt to save. Therefore, we need to talk about hope, but not about a blind, illusory hope that ignores the facts. We are talking about a hope that is born of the conviction that God remains in control even when everything seems out of control. May he keep his promises, even if the path passes through the valley of the shadow of death, that he prepares his people even when the whole world cries out for despair. Yes, the end times are scary, but it is also glorious, because it is the beginning of eternity with Christ. And perhaps, in the middle of all this, is the biggest question. How will you react? Will you hide behind fear or take a stand in faith? Will you deny the signs or allow them to shake your soul? The war in Iran, the tension in the Middle East, the threats to Israel, all of this may seem just geopolitical to some, but to you, it is a calling, an awakening, a divine warning, and this alert is just beginning, because if this war happens, what will the relationship between Israel and Iran look like in the prophecy? There are rivalries that are born of political disputes, others of cultural differences. But there is one kind of tension that surpasses any timeline, one that carries a spiritual weight. And this is exactly what defines the relationship between Israel and Iran. This is not just a modern feud between two governments with opposing ideologies. It is an ancestral clash, prophesied in the scriptures with deep roots in the history of redemption. When we look with the eyes of faith, we realize that this tension has more to do with divine promises and spiritual rejections than with geographical boundaries. Iran, as the successor of the ancient Persian Empire, had moments of alliance with the Jewish people. It was Cyrus the Persian who authorized the rebuilding of the temple. But time passed, and the nation that was once an instrument of restoration became the antagonist of the promise. Today, the speeches coming from Tehran are loaded with hatred, openly calling for the destruction of Israel. This is not politics, it is prophecy. It is the modern manifestation of an ancient spiritual warfare where God's plan is constantly challenged by forces rising up against his chosen people. The book of Ezekiel already pointed to this confrontation. When he mentions Persia allying with other nations against Israel, he is not describing a remote possibility, he is revealing a reality. And this reality has already begun to take shape. The Middle East is in turmoil. Iran strengthens itself militarily, influences extremist movements, forms alliances with Gog, and gets closer and closer to fulfilling its part of the eschatological script. Meanwhile, Israel remains surrounded, resisting, and prophetically out at the center of it all. The most curious thing is that, to natural eyes, Israel should not survive so many threats. A small country, surrounded by enemies, pressured by sanctions, hated at many diplomatic tables. But spiritually, Israel is sustained by the promise. It is the people of the pact, of the covenant, and this divine protection bothers us. Iran hates Israel not just because of the land, but because of what Israel stands for, God's faithfulness to his word. And therein lies the root of the prophesied tension between the two peoples. It's not just about foreign policy, it's about eternity, and you can't ignore the role of religion in all this. The Iranian regime is driven by an eschatological ideology of its own. They await the return of the Mahdi, their Islamic Messiah, and believe that chaos, including a war against Israel, is necessary to hasten that coming. On the other hand, Israel awaits the fulfillment of the promises of the Messiah, many of which have already been fulfilled in Jesus, and others will be fulfilled at his return. The clash between these two hopes generates an unsustainable tension, and the Bible knew this long before the newspapers reported it. This tension also manifests itself in the surrounding nations. Iran's allies, such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and other extremist groups, are pieces in the spiritual chessboard aimed at pressuring Israel. Attacks are constant. Skirmishes turn into bigger conflicts. And with each new incident, the prophecy that Israel would be a cup of dizziness to all nations, Zechariah 12:2, is fulfilled exactly. It doesn't matter who is in government. It doesn't matter the diplomatic agreements. Confrontation is inevitable because it is written. And what about the almost visceral hatred that part of the world harbors for Israel? A country that only wants to exist in peace, but that carries with it the weight of millennial promises. Many don't understand, but spiritually this rejection has deep roots. Jesus himself said that Jerusalem would be trampled on until the times of the Gentiles were completed, and until that time arrives, the city remains in the eye of the prophetic hurricane. Iran only vocalizes what many silently wish, to see Israel erased from the map, but God will not allow it. Looking at all of this, it is impossible not to see the connection between scripture and current events. The tension between Israel and Iran is like a rubber band stretched to the maximum, and every provocation, every attack, every inflammatory speech carries the risk of rupture. And when this rupture happens, it will not only be regional, it will be global, it will be prophetic, it will be spiritual. And at that time, many who have ignored biblical prophecies will understand, too late, that God never played with his words. Still, there is room for redemption. The Bible itself shows that even in the midst of war, God stretches out his hand. Jews, Persians, Arabs, Gentiles, all can be reached by grace. But it is necessary to open your eyes before it is too late. The confrontation between Israel and Iran may be inevitable, but its spiritual consequence may still be redemptive. It is the time to discern the signs and choose which side of prophecy you will be on the side of the promise or on the side of the resistance. And if this tension explodes for good, what will it bring to the world? How will governments react? And if the prophecy we are following is fulfilled before our eyes, what kind of transformation will this cause? What will come next? Because once fulfilled, the prophecy changes everything. And perhaps the modern world is not even close to ready for it. Now imagine the following scenario. Iran and its allies finally attack Israel, exactly as described in Ezekiel 38 and 39. The nations are in an uproar. The world is collapsing diplomatically. Markets plummet. The headlines go crazy. And in the middle of it all, Christians are beginning to recognize that what for so long has been heralded as the prophetic future is now a historical present. It sounds like a movie script, right? But it's not fiction. It's the Bible. And if this prophecy is fulfilled in our day, the impact on the modern world will simply be irreversible. The first major implication is the collapse of international stability. All it takes is a direct conflict between Israel and Iran for powers like the US, China, and Russia to enter the game. The war will not remain regional. It will become global. And with that, a reconfiguration of power will be inevitable. A new world equilibrium will emerge, or rather, it will be forced. Many scholars associate this new scenario with the preparation for the emergence of the Antichrist, a global leader who will bring apparent peace, but with dark intentions. Does this sound familiar? Another immediate consequence will be the shake of human confidence. Science, politics, and large institutions will be unable to contain the chaos. The prophecy being fulfilled will dismantle the sandcastle of modern self-sufficiency. Generations who have been taught to ignore the Bible will begin to realize that they were living outside of spiritual reality. The arrogance of rationalism will be wounded. And in that existential void, there will arise a desire for direction, a thirst for meaning. The problem is, who will offer the answers, God or the deception? Moreover, the fulfillment of such an explicit prophecy will have a shocking effect on the world's religions. Many religious systems will not know how to react. Some will deny it, others will try to reinterpret it. But the truth will be too stark to ignore. The Bible will gain relevance as never before. But false prophets will also emerge, manipulating the facts to justify their narratives. Jesus had already warned that this would happen. In other words, the fulfillment of prophecy will not only bring light, it will bring confusion as well. Discernment will be essential. From a technological and social point of view, the modern world will be faced with new rules. Border control, identification systems, digital censorship, all can be intensified under the justification of global security. And this scenario may be the perfect ground for the fulfillment of Revelation 13, where no one will be able to buy or sell without the famous mark. Does it seem exaggerated? Well, know that there are already systems being tested for this type of control. War can be the perfect pretext to implement irreversible measures. Another implication will be emotional and spiritual. Millions will collapse internally, lost without ground, but others will wake up. When the prophecy comes true, there will be a mass spiritual awakening. People who mocked faith will begin to seek answers. Entire families will turn their eyes to the sky. Faithful pastors will have their old messages rescued, and the Holy Spirit will move, as in the days of Joel. War will bring pain, but it will also bring a harvest. The darkness will spread, but the light, as always, will shine even brighter. And what about the media and culture? When the eschatological events are undeniable, movies, music, books, and social media will go into crisis mode. The truth will tear the veil of fiction. People will no longer be able to consume empty entertainment in the same way. There will be a rupture of values. And what was once the trivialization of evil will now be recognized as preparation for chaos. Many will say, How have we not seen before? But those who know the biblical prophecies will know God had already warned them, and now there is no turning back. Political structures will also feel the impact. The current system of fragile and corrupt democratic governments will collapse morally and practically. There will be a cry for a strong leader, a political messiah, and it is in this leadership vacuum that the world will be vulnerable to accepting any solution. Even the most dangerous, eschatology will become a world affair, no longer restricted to pulpits but debated in parliaments. And this new political climate will be like dry wood, waiting for the final spark. But perhaps the most profound implication is personal. The prophecy being fulfilled before your eyes demands a response. Ignoring will no longer be possible. Ridiculing won't work. Neutrality will cease to exist. Each person will have to choose, either bow before the fulfillment of the word or hardens his heart and throws himself into rebellion once and for all. And here's the point. The fulfillment of prophecy is the greatest watershed in history. And if that happens now, your life will no longer be able to go on as before. So think with me. What if the war in Iran is really the trigger for the fulfillment of Ezekiel 38? What if the newspapers tomorrow print the beginning of a prophetic confrontation? What would that mean for you, for your faith, to the world you know? Because when prophecy is fulfilled, there is no room left for theory, just for decision. And at the end of the day, everything we've seen so far leads us to an even more urgent question. What comes next? It would be this war, just the beginning of something even bigger. In the face of all this, you can't pretend that everything is normal anymore. Biblical prophecies are unfolding before our eyes, and the war between Iran and Israel may be just the beginning. What seems to be just another conflict in the Middle East. It could be the final gear that activates a chain of apocalyptic events. And when the spiritual scene moves, no nation remains neutral, not even those who say they are at peace. What about you? Will you continue to ignore the signs, or will you wake up before it's too late? Because once prophecy is fulfilled, it changes everything, including your position on the truth. The prophetic clock is no longer just ticking. He's about to sound, and when it sounds, there will be no more time for rehearsals, only decision. But before this scenario is completed, a question begins to gain strength among scholars, world leaders, and even behind the scenes of governments. Is Israel entering into a secret alliance with the United States, more specifically with Trump, as a strategic preparation for a global confrontation and more? Would this alliance be political or prophetic? Is it related to the construction of the Third Temple, to Armageddon, or to something even deeper, which no one is expecting? In the next video, you will understand why the possible rapprochement between Israel and Trump may not be just a diplomatic move, but a prophetic alignment with eternal implications. Israel's alliance with Trump, preparing for Armageddon. Don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and comment below. Do you think this alliance is already in progress? Or is it just conspiracy theory?